It was the morning of February 13, 2017, in the small Midwestern town of Delphi, Indiana. The air was cold but clear, one of those late winter days that promised the first hint of spring. Schools were closed for a teacher's workday, and many families treated it as a bonus holiday. Two close friends, Liberty German and Abigail Williams, both in middle school, made plans to spend the afternoon together. They were typical teenagers, chatting online, laughing, and looking for something to do before sunset. Around lunchtime, Liberty's older sister dropped them off near the Monon High Bridge trail, an old railroad path that wound through trees and across a high, weathered bridge. The bridge was a local landmark, quiet except for the wind through the boards and the sound of footsteps echoing above Deer Creek. Not long after they arrived, Liberty began taking photos with her phone. One image showed Abby walking across the bridge in a bright jacket. It looked like an ordinary picture between friends. By mid-afternoon, when family members expected the girls to return, calls went unanswered. At first, there was no panic, just confusion. A few hours later, as daylight began to fade, the worry became real. Parents drove the route toward the trailhead again and again, calling their names into the cold air. By early evening, the Carroll County Sheriff's Office and dozens of volunteers were on scene with flashlights, searching both sides of the trail and the steep banks below the bridge. The search continued into the night, the quiet interrupted only by the crunch of boots and the sound of voices echoing through the woods. The next morning, volunteers resumed their sweep. Not far from the creek, in a wooded area about half a mile from the bridge, searchers discovered the bodies of the two girls. Investigators quickly sealed off the scene. Law enforcement officers from several agencies arrived, including the Indiana State Police and the FBI. News spread through Delphi almost instantly. A town of fewer than 3,000 residents became a place defined by disbelief. Within hours, reporters lined the narrow roads and television vans parked beside farmland. Grief counselors met with classmates at school, and church doors stayed open into the evening. For a community that prided itself on safety, the shock was absolute. As police began their work, details remained closely guarded. Investigators confirmed only that the deaths were being treated as homicides. They collected evidence from the trail, the bridge, and the area near the creek. Residents who had walked those paths hundreds of times suddenly looked at them differently. Parents drove their children to school instead of letting them walk. Outdoor gatherings were canceled. Fear settled in like a fog no one could clear. Then came a revelation that changed everything. Liberty's phone held video evidence captured during the time they were on the bridge. Investigators revealed that part of the recording contained a short clip showing a man walking toward the girls and a few seconds of his voice giving them an order. That discovery turned Liberty's final moments into the most important clue of the entire investigation. Law enforcement released a still image from the video. A man wearing jeans, a blue jacket, and a cap, walking on the bridge toward the camera. The public quickly gave him a name, the bridge suspect. The audio, distorted but unmistakable, was later shared in part to the public in hopes someone would recognize the voice. It was haunting in its simplicity and would become one of the most recognized fragments of evidence in modern true crime history. The image spread worldwide. National networks covered the case. Online forums dedicated to identifying the man analyzed every pixel of the photo. The FBI joined the investigation alongside state and local officers, setting up a tip line and offering a reward. Thousands of leads poured in. Every call was logged, every theory checked, but none led directly to a suspect. As days turned into weeks, and weeks into months, Delphi remained under a quiet shadow. Even in the earliest stages, the families of Liberty and Abigail became the steady center of the story. They attended every press conference, thanking volunteers and pleading for information. Their faces became symbols of endurance, the determination of parents who refused to let their children be forgotten. The town began organizing vigils at the trailhead, lighting candles under the old bridge. Local students painted hearts with the girls' initials on school windows. What began as a small-town tragedy was now a national search for answers. Yet, with every day that passed without an arrest, frustration grew. Detectives worked in silence, unwilling to release specifics that might compromise the case. Rumors filled the void. Some residents wondered if the killer was a stranger passing through. Others feared it was someone they had seen every day in the grocery store. The uncertainty became its own kind of torment. But amid the tension, one truth held firm. The girls had not been forgotten, and the recording on that phone remained the key to finding whoever had taken them. If stories like this matter to you, stories about truth, courage, and the people who refuse to let darkness win, stay with us. Subscribe to help keep these voices alive, because this story is far from over. The investigation was only beginning, and Delphi was about to learn how long justice can take. In the days after the discovery, Delphi became a place defined by the search for one face. Investigators from the Indiana State Police and the FBI worked inside a temporary command post near the trail. Detectives studied Liberty's phone data frame by frame, comparing the still image to anyone who might have been on the trail that day. They began asking residents to check home cameras, store surveillance systems, and even doorbell recordings for passing vehicles. Every hour brought new information, but no clear suspect. Soon, the first composite sketch was released to the public. It showed a man appearing middle-aged, heavy-set, with a goatee and a cap pulled low over his eyes. The drawing spread through television broadcasts, posters, and social media. Tips surged, some credible, some impossible, but investigators treated each one as the potential break they needed. As weeks passed without an arrest, the community's mood shifted from fear to frustration. Detectives remained tight-lipped, explaining that too much disclosure could hurt the investigation. That silence led to speculation, and speculation fueled entire online movements. Digital communities dedicated to solving crimes began dissecting the case. Users slowed the short video clip, enhancing colors and brightness to find details unseen by the human eye. Some compared the man's walk to known residents. Others overlaid the image on maps, estimating his distance from the camera. Law enforcement monitored these discussions, grateful for public interest but cautious about misinformation. For the families, each new rumor reopened pain that never had time to close. Throughout 2018 and 2019, police issued periodic updates. Then, in April 2019, 2 years after the killings, investigators released a new sketch, completely different from the first. The man appeared younger, clean-shaven, and slimmer. Alongside it came a new public message. This was now the primary suspect. The shift shocked nearly everyone following the case. Theories exploded online. Some thought the first drawing was of an unrelated witness. Others believed investigators had changed direction entirely after receiving new information. Police would not elaborate. They asked the public to look again at the second image and to imagine the man as someone they might know. A neighbor, a coworker, or even a relative. For Delphi residents, the two sketches felt like mirrors of uncertainty. Which one was right? Could both represent the same person seen at different angles or at different stages of life? Investigators urged patience. They maintained that crucial evidence was still being processed. Behind the scenes, detectives revisited hundreds of interviews and re-examined physical samples collected from the scene. Technology had advanced since 2017. Labs could now extract trace DNA profiles that were once impossible. Yet months continued to pass without a public breakthrough. The trail grew colder, but the memory of the girls kept the community searching. Fundraisers built memorials near the bridge and supported youth programs in their names. A new section of the trail was renamed to honor them. Each act of remembrance kept attention on the investigation. Even when news cycles moved on, local residents refused to let the story fade. In every grocery line and at every school event, someone would bring up the case. How no one could believe a killer had slipped away in daylight and remained unseen for so long. 5 years after the tragedy, in the autumn of 2022, whispers of movement began to spread again through town. A small group of reporters noticed increased police activity around Delphi. Vehicles from state agencies were seen near the same trail that had been quiet for years. For the first time in a long time, people wondered if the silence meant something was finally happening behind closed doors. If you want to follow the story as it unfolds, stay close. Subscribe to make sure you hear the next phase because the next call Delphi received would change everything. Late October 2022 began like any other week in Delphi, until news broke that detectives had made an arrest. The man's name was Richard Allen, a 50-year-old pharmacy technician who lived quietly with his wife less than 2 miles from the Monon High Bridge. For years, he had gone to work, attended local events, and even printed photographs for residents who came through the store. He was the kind of person no one had ever suspected. When authorities confirmed that Allen had been taken into custody, disbelief rippled through the town. Reporters surrounded the courthouse. Law enforcement held a short press conference but refused to share details, saying the investigation was still active. Behind that secrecy was a carefully built case, 5 years in the making. According to the probable cause affidavit later unsealed, Allen had admitted to being on the trail the same day the girls vanished. He told investigators he walked along the bridge to watch fish below, claiming he saw 3 young girls before turning back. But digital data, witness statements, and a single unspent bullet found near the victims tied him more closely to the scene. Forensic testing revealed that the bullet had been cycled through a pistol registered to Allen. Investigators believed this physical link connected him to the murders. The public reaction was intense. Some saw the arrest as long overdue justice. Others questioned how someone living in plain sight could have escaped notice for half a decade. Online forums lit up with theories about what new technology or witness account had finally broken the case. Police did not answer. They urged patience again, reminding everyone that speculation could harm both the investigation and the families. Court filings painted the early outlines of the prosecution's case. A timeline built on Allen's own admissions, digital footprints, and ballistics. Yet Allen maintained his innocence. His defense attorneys argued that the bullet evidence was circumstantial and that contamination could not be ruled out. They claimed investigators had relied too heavily on coincidence. The small-town courtroom, suddenly at the center of national attention, became a stage for every unanswered question that had haunted Delphi since 2017. As hearings began, a flood of sealed documents hinted at more evidence still unseen by the public. Prosecutors described sensitive material they said could compromise ongoing leads. The judge imposed a gag order, restricting what attorneys and police could say outside the courtroom. Reporters camped outside each session, waiting for any glimpse of the accused man. Each time he appeared, quiet and expressionless, the cameras captured what many in Delphi struggled to process: the alleged killer of 2 children standing only a few feet away. For the families, the arrest brought mixed emotions. Relief that someone had finally been charged, sorrow that nothing could undo the years of pain, and renewed determination to see justice carried through. They attended court dates surrounded by supporters wearing shirts printed with the girls' names. When asked about the proceedings, they spoke carefully, reminding the world that the focus should remain on Liberty and Abigail, their laughter, their friendship, their light. Meanwhile, the defense prepared its challenge. They began to suggest an alternate explanation, a theory that others may have been involved. Whispered terms like ritual and group activity surfaced in filings and online commentary. It was controversial, speculative, and yet impossible to ignore. The idea that the crime could have been part of something larger unsettled even veteran investigators. Still, no public evidence supported the claim. Prosecutors dismissed it as distraction. Outside the courthouse, national media arrived daily. Satellite trucks lined the streets. Delphi, once a quiet Midwestern town, now carried the weight of a story watched across the world. Residents avoided interviews. Businesses kept televisions muted to escape the endless analysis. For those who lived there, the bridge was no longer just a landmark. It had become a symbol of what they lost and what they were still fighting to understand. Every legal motion, every newly released document, pulled people deeper into the mystery. Who was Richard Allen in 2017? Why had his name not appeared in public lists of suspects earlier? How had he managed to live freely for so long while a community grieved just down the road? The questions lingered without clear answers. Investigators, bound by the court's restrictions, could only hint that more evidence would come to light at trial. For now, the community waited again, just as it had in those long years before the arrest. But this time, they were waiting not for discovery, but for justice. And with each passing month, anticipation built toward a courtroom confrontation that could finally reveal what really happened on that winter afternoon. If you followed the case this far, stay with the story. Subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. The defense unveils a theory so unexpected that even seasoned observers struggled to believe it. As the months passed after Richard Allen's arrest, attention shifted from the shock of his capture to the slow, complex machinery of the court. What had begun as a straightforward criminal case now started to take on a darker, more tangled shape. The defense began to hint that the murders of Liberty German and Abigail Williams might not have been the act of a single man. Their filings introduced a phrase that would soon dominate every headline: the ritualistic theory. According to the defense team, their client was being framed or manipulated by shadowy figures who had orchestrated the crime for reasons beyond comprehension. They described alleged connections between Allen and a small group of local men who, they claimed, practiced disturbing forms of belief and symbolism. It was a claim without public proof, but the mere suggestion ignited the imagination of a public already consumed by the mystery. Prosecutors immediately rejected the idea as fiction. They stated firmly that the evidence remained physical and specific: Allen's presence at the scene, his own statements, the ballistic match, and other undisclosed material. They accused the defense of planting conspiracy to distract from the evidence and to sway potential jurors. Yet even with the court's gag order, the theory spread faster than anyone could contain it. News outlets debated the claim nightly. Online spaces dissected every document, searching for coded language or hidden meaning. Some commentators wondered if the defense's filing had unintentionally endangered potential witnesses or tainted the jury pool. Judges issued warnings. Portions of filings were sealed again, citing security and safety concerns. The once quiet courtroom in Carroll County now held hearings where each side accused the other of violating professional conduct. Through it all, Richard Allen remained mostly silent. Reports suggested he was struggling in custody, isolated, thin, and at times incoherent. His lawyers claimed he was being mistreated and that his mental health was deteriorating rapidly. Prosecutors countered that the jail was following standard procedures and that any distress came from the gravity of his own situation. The image of Allen that emerged from those reports was far from the calm man once seen behind a pharmacy counter. The pretrial period became less about facts and more about control of narrative, of public opinion, of the flow of information. Every motion and countermotion was analyzed by an audience of millions. To many, it felt as if the case had become bigger than the murders themselves, a cultural moment about the limits of justice in the digital age. How do you find 12 unbiased jurors when the entire country believes it already knows the story? Inside Delphi, emotions ran deep. Residents who once avoided discussing the case now found it impossible to ignore. Families locked their doors a little earlier, remembering the fear that had never fully left. The bridge, now fenced off and surrounded by cameras, remained silent, a reminder of both the tragedy and the years of unanswered questions that followed. Candlelight vigils continued, though smaller now, quieter, held mostly by those who had known the girls personally. Then came another turn. Documents surfaced suggesting that investigators were exploring digital evidence tied to phone data and vehicle movements near the trail. Though not publicly confirmed, whispers suggested that additional individuals might still be under review. The idea reignited the defense's claim that Allen had not acted alone. But prosecutors stood firm. No other arrests were pending, and no credible link to any organized group had been established. As hearings dragged on, frustration grew. Delays mounted. Legal teams requested more time for discovery, more time to analyze evidence, more time to prepare for a trial that could last months. For the victims' families, that waiting was its own kind of torment. They wanted answers, clear, undeniable, final. Yet justice moved slowly, deliberately, as the system demanded. When a new judge was appointed to the case after a series of recusal motions, some saw it as a reset. The hope was that, with a fresh start, proceedings would regain focus. But even that change came with controversy, arguments over sealed evidence, leaked documents, and online commentary that risked contempt of court. The line between public interest and sensationalism blurred almost completely. Still, one truth anchored the entire story. 2 young girls had been taken from their families, and no verdict or theory could undo that loss. Every person involved, the police, the attorneys, the residents, was caught between the need to find closure and the fear that true closure might never come. Outside the courtroom, the community waited again, just as it had so many times before. Each update brought hope, each delay disappointment. But there was a shared understanding that Delphi's story was not only about one man or one trial. It was about the resilience of those who refused to let their memory fade. And as the pre-trial motions neared their final stages, the weight of expectation grew. Everyone knew the next phase would not just determine guilt or innocence. It would reveal whether 5 years of searching, grief, and perseverance would finally lead to justice. If you've followed this far, stay with the story. Subscribe so you don't miss any details, because what comes next isn't just a courtroom verdict. It's the final reckoning of everything Delphi has lived through since that winter afternoon. When the trial finally began, years of silence broke open in a single crowded courtroom. Reporters filled every available seat, their cameras waiting outside the building since dawn. Families of the victims sat quietly in the front rows, side by side, surrounded by supporters wearing small purple ribbons pinned to their clothes. Richard Allen was escorted in wearing a plain shirt and shackles, thinner than before, his face drawn and pale. The judge reminded everyone that this was not a spectacle. It was a search for truth. The prosecution began by walking the jury through the timeline that investigators had reconstructed. The video from Liberty's phone, the man seen on the bridge, the evidence collected along the trail, the unspent bullet that forensic analysts had matched to Allen's firearm. It was a careful presentation. Steady, detailed, each piece meant to build a chain that led directly from that February afternoon to the man sitting at the defense table. Witness after witness described what they saw that day. Some had been hiking nearby. Others had passed a man fitting Allen's general description walking alone on the trail. Their memories, softened by time, were supported by photos, phone data, and cell tower pings. Prosecutors emphasized that while some details varied, the overall story held steady. Allen had placed himself at the scene, and physical evidence supported that fact. The defense countered immediately. They argued that the ballistic connection was weak and that the state's theory relied on assumptions more than certainty. They highlighted gaps in the timeline, claiming that no one had actually seen Allen harm the girls. They suggested that the phone footage might have captured only part of a larger, more complex event, one involving others who had never been charged. It was a subtle nod back to their ritual narrative, though the judge had warned against turning the trial into a forum for conspiracy. Through it all, the atmosphere in the courtroom was heavy. Each photograph displayed, each piece of evidence mentioned, carried a quiet weight. The jurors watched closely, often glancing toward the families when testimony became emotional. The defense objected frequently, challenging wording, timing, and the handling of exhibits. The judge sustained some, overruled others, keeping a steady rhythm meant to prevent chaos from overtaking grief. Outside, crowds gathered daily behind barricades. Some held signs calling for justice. Others demanded transparency. News stations broadcast live updates every hour. Delphi, once again, was the center of a nation's attention. The town streets filled with strangers who came not to sightsee, but to stand near the place where innocence had been stolen. Midway through the trial, the prosecution introduced expert testimony about the bullet fragment. The specialist explained the method used to match the rifling marks from Allen's Sig Sauer pistol to the cartridge found near the scene. It was technical but decisive. The defense attempted to cast doubt, suggesting contamination or mishandling. Yet the jury listened intently, their expressions giving little away. For many, it was the first moment the physical evidence seemed to speak louder than speculation. Then came one of the most emotional moments of the trial, Liberty German's grandmother taking the stand. Her voice was steady but filled with pain as she described the days after the girls disappeared, the search, and the night they were found. She spoke not of anger but of heartbreak, reminding everyone why the case mattered. Her testimony brought silence to the courtroom, even among the reporters who had covered tragedies for years. For a brief moment, the trial felt less like a legal proceeding and more like a memorial. The defense followed with their own witnesses, character references, mental health experts, and a firearms consultant who questioned the reliability of the match. They painted Allen as an ordinary man, a father and husband who had lived peacefully for decades. They claimed the state's evidence was circumstantial, built on probability rather than certainty. But the prosecution countered that the odds of coincidence were almost impossible. As days turned into weeks, tension built with every session. Each side accused the other of withholding context. Motions for mistrial were filed and denied. Outside the courthouse, supporters of both families gathered with candles as evening fell. They spoke quietly among themselves, unwilling to let anger drown out empathy. It wasn't about vengeance anymore, it was about truth. When closing arguments arrived, the courtroom was completely still. The prosecution spoke of two young girls who trusted the world to be kind and of the man they said betrayed that trust. The defense spoke of doubt, how justice required certainty beyond question, not emotional conviction. They reminded the jury that evidence could be interpreted in many ways, and that the burden of proof belonged entirely to the state. The judge instructed the jury with deliberate calm, reading each charge slowly, clearly. Then the jurors were led out to deliberate. Hours passed, stretching into a long night. Reporters waited on the courthouse lawn. Families sat together in silence. For the first time in years, Delphi seemed to hold its breath. Whatever the verdict would be, everyone knew one truth. This case had already changed them. It had exposed the darkest edges of small-town life, the power of persistence, and the cost of unanswered questions. Delphi was no longer just a dot on the map. It had become a symbol of how fragile safety can be and how far people will go to reclaim it. If you followed this far, stay close. Subscribe so you don't miss what happens next. The verdict arrives, and with it, revelations that will forever change what we thought we knew about the Delphi case. The courthouse was silent when the jury returned. Reporters pressed forward, cameras waiting outside in the cold. Inside, the families sat together, their hands clasped tightly, the air heavy with expectation. The jurors filed in, faces unreadable. The judge asked if they had reached a verdict. The foreperson stood, holding a single sheet of paper. The words that followed would echo through Delphi for years. Richard Allen was found guilty on both counts of murder. The courtroom didn't erupt, it simply exhaled. A wave of emotion swept through the rows. Some cried softly. Others sat frozen, staring straight ahead. The families of Liberty German and Abigail Williams held each other, eyes closed, tears falling not from surprise, but from release. After 6 long years, the waiting was over. Allen sat motionless as the words were read. No visible reaction, no plea for understanding. When the judge asked if he had anything to say before sentencing, his reply was short, a denial of guilt. He insisted that he had been wrongly accused, that evidence had been twisted, and that he had no part in what had happened that February day. His attorneys promised an appeal, saying the fight wasn't finished. But the conviction was clear. The judge sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Outside, the crowd waited for confirmation. When the news spread, a low murmur rolled through the street. Some cheered, others simply stood still, unsure how to react to something that had lived in their minds for half a decade. For many, justice was not celebration. It was closure wrapped in sorrow. The town had its answer, but not its peace. In the days that followed, reporters flooded the area again, broadcasting scenes of the bridge, the trail, and the courthouse steps. Commentators debated what the verdict meant. Some believed it proved the system still worked, that patience and persistence could still uncover truth, even after years of silence. Others questioned whether everything had truly been revealed. The defense's claims, the theories of accomplices, the unanswered questions about evidence. All of it lingered, like shadows that refused to fade. The families, though exhausted, spoke publicly for the first time since the verdict. They thanked law enforcement and the community for never giving up. They spoke of the girls not as victims, but as lights that continued to guide them. "We waited for this," one family member said quietly, "but we also know this isn't the end. It's just the beginning of learning how to live with the truth." Delphi itself began to change again. The bridge trail, once marked by crime scene tape, became a place of remembrance. Fresh flowers appeared every morning. Visitors came from across the country, leaving small notes, bracelets, and drawings. The girls' names were carved into new memorial stones at the entrance to the trail, symbols not of tragedy, but of endurance. For locals, it was a place to breathe again, to reclaim a part of their town that had been frozen in fear. But behind that peace, questions still stirred. How had a man who lived so close, who interacted with the community every day, remained invisible for so long? Could there have been warning signs? Investigators hinted at more details yet to be released. Digital data, witness accounts, and other forensic results that had not been part of the public record. Those documents, they said, would eventually be unsealed once all appeals were exhausted. Until then, speculation continued, feeding the same digital discussions that had followed the case since the beginning. The verdict also sparked broader conversations across the true crime community. Delphi had become a study in how public participation could both help and hinder investigations. Millions of people had followed every update, analyzed photos, and shared theories. Some discoveries had even prompted real tips. Others had spread misinformation. The case had shown both the power and the danger of online obsession, a reminder that justice, while slow, must still be grounded in fact. As months passed, the national spotlight began to fade. Reporters left. The courthouse grew quiet again. Delphi returned to something closer to normal life, though it would never be the same. Children still played in the park. Stores reopened with new signs. But every local knew that beneath the calm, the memory of 2 young lives lost remained. And so did the lesson, that evil can wear an ordinary face, and that truth, no matter how deeply buried, can still rise to the surface. For Liberty and Abigail's families, justice was both a conclusion and a continuation. They began speaking at schools and community centers, encouraging safety awareness and compassion. They worked with local leaders to create foundations in the girls' names, focusing on youth programs and family support. Out of tragedy, something enduring had grown, a movement rooted in the belief that no one should ever be forgotten. And though the verdict had been read, Delphi's story was far from finished. Appeals loomed. Documents remained sealed. Theories persisted. The world had its answers but still sought understanding. Justice had come, but closure, as everyone learned, was something different entirely. If you've followed this far, stay with the story. Subscribe to keep exploring the final chapters, because what comes next isn't about guilt or innocence. It's about legacy, and how 2 small-town girls forever changed the face of American true crime. In the weeks after the verdict, the courthouse in Carroll County began to empty. The crowds were gone, the cameras packed away. For the first time in years, the small town of Delphi began to breathe again. Yet even as the noise faded, the story refused to end. Richard Allen's attorneys filed notice of appeal within days, arguing that procedural errors and withheld evidence had compromised his right to a fair trial. It was the beginning of another chapter, one less visible, but just as heavy. Legal experts debated the defense's next move. Some believed the appeal would focus on forensic testing, others on jury selection or the handling of sealed filings. Each theory echoed across social media, where the case had long lived in digital spaces far from the courthouse. Online forums reignited, podcasts dissected transcripts line by line, and video creators revisited every stage of the investigation, searching for patterns or overlooked details. The Delphi case had become more than a tragedy. It had become a phenomenon. In many ways, the internet had kept the story alive. The families had once used it to share photos, organize searches, and raise awareness. But the same platforms that helped also carried harm. Speculation blurred with accusation. Innocent residents were named, strangers were harassed, and conspiracy theories spread faster than corrections. The Delphi case had become a mirror showing how true crime fascination could both unite and divide people who never knew the victims personally. Yet through the noise, something remarkable persisted. a quiet insistence on remembering the girls as more than a mystery. At the heart of the story were two friends whose laughter had once filled the woods now haunted by silence. Their families continued to attend local events, keeping their names alive through scholarships, memorial runs, and community service programs. They spoke of hope, not hate, of change, not anger. They wanted the world to learn, not just to look. The town itself began to rebuild its image. Delphi was no longer defined only by tragedy. It became a place of remembrance, resilience, and resolve. Murals of Liberty and Abigail appeared downtown, painted not in somber tones, but in light, vibrant colors. Tourists who visited didn't come to gawk but to pay respect. The Monon High Bridge, once avoided, became part of guided memorial walks, led by volunteers who spoke about community healing and the importance of vigilance. In time, the trail that once symbolized loss began to represent strength. The case also changed how investigators approached small-town crimes. Law enforcement agencies across the country studied Delphi's investigation, the mistakes, the breakthroughs, the use of digital evidence. It reshaped how authorities handled public communication in high-profile cases, balancing transparency with sensitivity. The short clip captured on Liberty's phone had become one of the most analyzed pieces of digital evidence in modern history, showing the power of a single moment to change everything. Still, the appeal loomed like a shadow over the sense of closure. Months turned into a year, and legal filings continued quietly. Each new motion brought back the anxiety that justice might be undone. But the families, hardened by years of uncertainty, refused to lose faith again. They had learned that healing wasn't about waiting for a verdict. It was about living in a way that honored the memory of those they lost. Beyond Delphi, the case became a staple of documentaries, podcasts, and academic studies. It inspired discussions about safety, technology, and the boundaries of digital sleuthing. For many, it marked the moment when true crime storytelling changed, when the line between investigators and the public blurred, and when empathy became the most valuable form of justice. In classrooms, teachers spoke about the case as a lesson in resilience. In police departments, it became a case study in patience and persistence. And in homes around the world, viewers who followed every twist found themselves reflecting on how something so dark could happen in a place so ordinary. Delphi reminded people that evil does not always wear a mask. It can stand behind a counter, greet you with a smile, and still carry secrets too terrible to imagine. As the appeal process moved forward, the families chose not to dwell on legal updates. They focused instead on legacy, on the foundations they'd built, on the young people they were helping in the girls' names. They spoke often about gratitude, for the strangers who never stopped caring, for the officers who never stopped searching, and for the light that still seemed to guide them through the years of darkness. Justice, they learned, was not a single day in court. It was a choice made over and over again to keep living, to keep remembering, to keep believing that love is stronger than fear. And in that way, the story of Delphi no longer belonged only to the families or the investigators. It belonged to everyone who refused to forget. Years after the crime that shattered Delphi, the story still lingers in the air like a faint echo, never gone, just quieter. The bridge still stands, its rusted beams catching the evening light. The woods still whisper when the wind moves through them. And every February, people from all over gather there, not to mourn, but to remember. They bring flowers. They tie ribbons in purple and orange, the girls' favorite colors. Some pray, some stay silent, and others walk the trail to feel close to the place where innocence was lost but courage was found. For them, the Monon High Bridge is no longer just a crime scene. It's a symbol of how pain can become purpose. Liberty German and Abigail Williams left more than memories behind. They left a message. Liberty's quick thinking, recording the suspect on her phone, was an act of bravery that defined an era of awareness. It reminded parents, children, and entire communities that vigilance matters, that even the smallest action can shape justice. In her final moments, she gave investigators the one piece of evidence that would one day make all the difference. The investigation changed the way small-town crimes are understood. It brought new respect for the power of technology, for digital footprints, and for the persistence of ordinary people who refused to give up. From detectives to data analysts, from journalists to volunteers, each person carried a piece of the puzzle forward until it formed a picture of truth. Delphi proved that even in the face of horror, human resolve is unstoppable. But there's another legacy, one harder to define. It lives in the conversations parents now have with their kids before they go out. It lives in the trust between neighbors who once stopped saying hello but now look out for one another again. Delphi changed how people see safety, but it also reminded them of something greater. Community is the first line of protection, and compassion is the last form of justice. The families of Liberty and Abigail have become symbols of that compassion. They speak at schools, they raise funds, they support other victims' families who face the same darkness they once did. They learned that grief is not something to escape, it's something to guide you forward. And through their pain, they have shown a kind of strength that words can barely contain. In interviews, they rarely speak about anger. They speak about gratitude. For the thousands who sent letters, for the officers who worked holidays and weekends, for the strangers who prayed without ever visiting Delphi. They talk about legacy, about how their daughter's laughter still echoes in every good deed done in their memory. If one person chooses kindness because of them, one family member once said, then they didn't die for nothing. The Delphi case will always be studied, analyzed, and remembered. But behind every headline, every theory, every online debate, there are two girls, two lives that mattered beyond the tragedy. That's the truth that must never fade. When you look at their faces, you don't just see victims. You see the reason communities come together. You see the reason people still believe that justice, no matter how long it takes, is worth the fight. Over the years, individuals have shared this story, not to exploit it, but to ensure it's never forgotten. To use storytelling as a way to remind the world that evil hides in plain sight, but so does goodness. Every person who listens, shares, or learns from this story becomes part of its legacy. Because memory is what keeps light alive. And maybe that's what the Delphi case truly represents. Not just loss, but endurance. Not just fear, but faith. The belief that even in the darkest moments, truth has a way of rising. That no matter how long justice takes, it is still justice when it arrives. That love, even broken by tragedy, can outlast anything. As the sun sets over the Monon High Bridge, its orange glow stretches across the tracks where two friends once walked. Somewhere, the sound of laughter returns. Not in the air, but in the memories of those who refuse to forget. Because remembering them is how Delphi heals. If this story moved you, remember, behind every headline, there's a human story. Behind every name, a heartbeat that once was. Subscribe to stay with us as we continue exploring the real stories that remind us how fragile life is and how powerful truth can be. Because the more we learn, the closer we get to understanding the world and each other. And for Liberty and Abigail, may their light never fade.